Hello, today's lecture is Against Love by Laura Kipnis. And I apologize right now. My allergies are driving me crazy this morning, and so I sound like I have a cold, and I hope I don't break out sneezing while I'm doing this. If I get very far in, you're just going to have to put up with it because I don't want to re-record the whole thing. So we'll see how I do. Excuse me. One of the things I wanted to say here is that this is a new essay for me, so I'm having sort of probably a different reaction to it than to some of the others, other than Apaya. That's the other new one this quarter. The others I've read before and I'm familiar with them. I've taught them a few times and coming at them from that point of view. This one is new to me, and so I've had kind of finding this one of all of the ones we've read so far to be the most provocative for me personally, and I've kind of had to mull over my own reaction to the essay and my own thoughts about it. So I'm going to kind of muddle through that and share it with you. I think it's interesting. I hope it's interesting for you guys to think of me as also a reader of these essays, and for me to be transparent about my own process of reading, as I'm asking you to do. So one of the things that we're moving into in the next three essays, that would be Kipnis, Rodriguez, and Said, is a more explicit mixture of the personal and the political in the essays. The first three that we read were very academic and were raising the issue of communication and where an individual fits into the larger, broader community, or we're dealing with, the individual versus the society in some way, or some such thing, where the emphasis is very much on the individual as an abstraction, and in a very academic, very sort of high-end place, as we discussed many times. These next three are maybe more personal in that they all sort of take a different tone. This one I would argue is the least personal of the three because we don't know what Kipnis's real attitude and her real experience with love is. She does not share with us her own romantic history. And I want you to remember that as you're reading this, because it's really easy when you read something like this to make assumptions about her own personal life that we are not given any of that information. So keep that in mind as you read, or as you listen to the lecture, because you've already read the essay. But keep that in mind as you go through. The topic in these three is all going to be about people kind of reflecting in an abstract way on things that are very personal, so people's emotions. And so that's intentional. The first three were very academic, very sort of, this is the university, this is how we look at these topics, these broad things, this is how we look at complicated theories. This next group is a little bit different in terms of its tone. It should be easier to read on the one hand, but they're also fairly complex essays in another way, and you'll find them easier in the initial reading in that they won't have huge words and you won't get hung up in long, windy, complicated sentences like in some of the other essays. But don't be fooled into thinking that they're easier to read and understand, because they're still raising complex issues that are asking you to think about things in ways that are more ambiguous and ambivalent than you may have seen in some of the prior essays. So it's kind of, I've got the class designed that way on purpose because I want to challenge you in the beginning with the sort of traditional academic essay that's a challenge to read on paper. These essays are more of a challenge to sort of muddle through, think about, try to understand what they're saying. You guys have done a great job with that in the first group, but I want you to keep doing it, even though there's an illusion that these essays are simpler. The final two that we'll read are the most narrative, direct, and simple on their surfaces, but again, they raise some really interesting questions and some of the same ideas that we've been discussing all through the quarter, but from a slightly different lens. So I just want to make sure that you understand that these are not really, that you may find it easier to get through the page and read it more quickly, but that doesn't mean that the ideas in it are any easier. Okay, having said all that, the topic in this essay is very much the personal and the political and the intersection of those things. And Kipnis is trying to make a very explicit point about critiquing something that most of us don't think about. And I think that that's an interesting and provocative place for her to go. I found it very challenging to not fight her, not to read against the grain through a lot of the essay, which is, of course, what she's trying to do, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the topic here is explicitly the personal and the political. That's the direction that we're kind of moving into, is sort of personal and cultural, public and private. Those are terms I want you to have in your minds, the personal and the cultural, and then the other pairing of the public and private, because your next big essay project will be looking at those things in detail. So, excuse me. Be aware that that's definitely part of what we're trying to achieve in the next 3 essays. I will say that I had a difficult time, as I said a few minutes ago, not trying to read her essay and take it where she's pitching it. I kept feeling like I was being provoked, and trying to resist that as a reader and saying, I'm not going to let you provoke me, I'm going to read and try to see what you're saying, was a challenge for me, because I did find myself becoming provoked by what she was saying. And there's a reason for that. As she points out very clearly and very explicitly, the essay that she's writing is called a polemic essay, which is one style. It's not one that we tend to teach in the comp classes, because it's a difficult one to pull off, and it's not, quite honestly, it's not very safe. It's not one that you would necessarily use in your workplace writing if you find yourself needing to write in the workplace, and it's not one that we encourage necessarily in college student writing, for other classes outside of English, because it's, that's not usually what faculty want. So I've often had students say, in reading various kinds of essays, which I find interesting, that I was taught in comp that you have to present both sides. And I understand that, and I know what you're talking about. I know, of course, I know exactly where that comes from. But that's only one type of writing. That's a very specific kind of writing. The objective sort of, case balanced approach, sometimes case studies, I think, have that focus. There is a valid, a useful reason to write something that shows both sides, but it's probably inaccurate for a professor to tell you that that's the proper way to write a paper. That's one way to write a paper, and it's the way that is most accepted in school, and that's fine. But if you're a public writer, like a public intellectual, a person like Kipnis who's writing books and stuff like that, there's nothing that says you have to write that way or that that's the best or most appropriate way. That's crazy. There are all sorts of different ways to write all sorts of different texts, and in fact, most essays, most nonfiction writing is what we call a mixed genre. That is, it's got a little bit of this, it's got a little bit of that. Writers don't, say, I'm going to sit down and write, this sort of essay intentionally very often. But Kipnis does. She's suggesting that she's writing a polemic. A polemic is a piece that is deliberately provocative and deliberately one-sided. She's making an exaggerated argument on one side of an issue. And what she suggests very clearly, she says this very explicitly in her essay, that the other side, the side that's for love, has the stage in our culture, in Western modern culture. The idea of, finding a true love, being monogamous, getting married, all of those things are the dominant model, and that there's no need to argue for them, because the arguments for them are all over the place. And in fact, what I would say is that they do dominate, and the arguments for them oversimplify them. And I think that's one of my reactions to Kipnis, is that I think she's also in some ways oversimplifying the issue, but she's also oversimplifying the other side and not looking at it in all its complexity. And that's where my sort of reading against the grain for her comes in. This is definitely not the sort of classic traditional academic essay. But it is an essay that does demand of its reader not only, I'm going to poke you in the eye and like upend your beliefs, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of her rhetorical strategies and how she does that in a few minutes, but she's also using very sophisticated cultural theory behind um, what she's saying, and she makes explicit reference to some of those things, and I will talk a little bit about that again here in a minute. But she's definitely, this is not pitched at the ordinary everyday person who loves romance novels, or person who thinks that chick flicks are awesome. And I have nothing against those things, by the way. I'm not critiquing them in any way by saying that. I'm just suggesting that she is saying these things get all kinds of sort of uncritical reflection in our culture. There's, that, love is grand and you should find your one true love and all this kind of thing. And she's asking us to think about it from a different point of view. So, but these are not, these are essays. This essay is difficult in that she's using complex social theory or critical theory here, but she's also written it in a style that seems more friendly, sort of, or at least more less academic than what we've seen in other essays. So it's an interesting and challenging piece in that way. Some of the theories and sources that she's using here, I'm just going to sort of touch on these, and I'm not by any means an expert on these things. In my own work, I tend to be all of these things are all of these theorists are people who come up, and I read about, read people taking a Marcusean analysis of something or whatever, but they're not the ones that I'm as comfortable with. I tend to work in something called, like, that's sort of new historicist sort of, but I tend to take a very much of a let's look at the documents approach to literature and to the studies of things that I'm interested in. I'm curious about looking at how non-literary texts influence literature. So, how do a set of religious sermons by a particular minister affect the writing of someone who was in his church? How do newspaper articles about a particular sensational scandal at a particular time in history affect how did those sort of square with, how did they influence the writer who was in another country at the time that he was writing about something from a distance? How was he influenced by what he saw in the popular culture that, from afar? That kind of thing is what I'm interested in. So I tend to take a very historical, documents-based approach to things, and I'm familiar with all these theorists, but I have always, even when I was a grad student, been somewhat skeptical of the limits of theory, in that it's nice to have theory. I mean, look at what Foucault does. We read Foucault. I read all of your journal responses. I found a lot of you really, really thinking, I'm really thinking a lot about what Foucault said. And that's what theory, the best of what theory does, is to make you think about it. Where I have a problem with it is where people say, yeah, that's great. That's exactly right. You can apply Foucault to everything. That's where I start to see, this is my opinion, that's where I start to see problems with theory, that it becomes like an ideology that can be applied or layered over virtually any social construction whatsoever, any social institution. I think it's valuable to critique social institutions and to think about them through those lenses, but if you always think of them that way and only think of them that way, then you're missing out on other opportunities to see something from a different point of view. So coming at this as somebody who, sat through grad school and read a bunch of theory and was expected to apply theory to literature, which I realize very few of you have had to do and certainly not in any really significant systematic way, at least not yet. Maybe some of you will. I kind of come at it differently and have a certain skepticism for it, and disagree with it and dislike it when it gets overused. So having said that, there is some value in reading some of these abstract theoretical things and thinking about, how do they give us an opportunity to look at something differently? And that's what Kipnis is doing, is applying basically post-Marxist, neo-Marxist theories to the idea of love and treating love as if it were a consumer commodity. And I think in some ways that's an interesting point. It's not unique with her. Other people have made similar sorts of arguments, but it's interesting to look at it that way. So some of the theories that she's working with here, the one that's the most prominent is the coming out of Marx. I'm sure some of you are familiar with who Marx is, and some of you are not, and just think communism. Marx was mid-19th century economist who, at a time when capitalism was sort of starting to become dominant but hadn't quite gotten the foothold that it has today in the West, it was starting to, but it wasn't quite there. He was critiquing it and saying, wait a minute, here are some of the problems with capitalism. A lot of what he had to say about the problems of capitalism actually were very influential in that the early industrialization, as I've mentioned, I think before, was a difficult. There was a sudden, not that there hadn't always been inequality in economic inequality. You always had like people who were vastly rich and other people who were poor. The industrialization upended the sort of traditional models where you had people who were like artisans who worked for themselves in small towns. Suddenly they were being displaced by, cheaper goods from large factories, and they couldn't sell their stuff anymore. And so a lot of them had to move into the cities and go to work in factories where they had prior been basically like small business owners. There were no workplace laws at all in the middle of the 19th century in Europe or in America. And as a result of that, workers were extremely exploited. There were parliamentary hearings in Britain around that time about this, and you can go online and read maybe not online, you might have to go to an actual library. But there are documents available on preserved documents available on various kinds of, back when I was in college, it was microfilm and stuff like that. Nowadays, I'm sure it's PDFs, but where you can look at the proceedings of the parliamentary hearings on industrialization and reform, and it amounted to the passing of reform laws that limited the length of the day that you were allowed to work, that put into place child labor laws, mandated a break, and eventually, after many years, this wasn't until the mid 20th century, minimum wage, all of those kinds of things came about because of in part because of you could make the argument the theories of Marx were part of that. Marx was making these arguments and people were taking up the mantle and saying, capitalism is, unchecked is a dangerous thing. And of course we're still arguing about this. I mean, it's certainly a deep part of the, political and economic arguments in our own country about how much government intervention, how much should the market be free to do whatever it wants. I would make the argument that, the somewhere in the middle is probably the best approach because, both the extreme of a centralized state like we saw with the Soviet Union or in China has a lot of flaws and a lot of difficulties, but so too does unchecked capitalism because, then people can do whatever they want and make things that kill people and, harm their own workers. And, there has to be some sort of common sense middle in there. So in any case, Marx is talking about all of these things in the middle of the 19th century when it's kind of like the wild, wild west in terms of industrialization. And, later on in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, you have the growth of something called the Frankfurt School in Germany that was mostly post World War II. They were mid-century theorists who were all around a particular university in Frankfurt, Germany, and were all what are now referred to as neo-Marxists, sort of taking Marxist ideas and then moving them beyond economy into culture and looking at Western culture through the lens of Marxism. And the idea that much of our culture is influenced by economies and capitalism, and what are some of the downfalls of capitalism, and what are some of the difficulties of it. So Kipnis is used. If you probably noticed this right off in the essay, one of the things she spends most of her time talking about, especially early, is the idea of love as work. And there's this sort of equating of the workplace and the need to work at your relationship and working at home and what a drag that is and all that kind of thing. So she's making very explicit sort of borrowings from the idea of economies and the workplace that are very much out of the Marxist school, and then following on the Frankfurt School folks, like especially Herbert Marcuse, looking at the repressive tendencies that are built into capitalist democracies, because a capitalist democracy, although it is a democracy, is a powerful force that wants to stay in power. And as a result, it is pushing itself towards, making sure that people conform with each other so that they will buy stuff, they will do, they will act in, appropriate ways. And here you might want to think about Foucault and the idea of surveillance. I mean, Foucault's talking about a specific thing, but Foucault's making points that are not out of line with some of these other folks. And in fact, he's working around the same time as these guys. They were a little bit earlier, but they were still alive when he's a little bit later, but they're still kind of all roughly in the same kind of 20-year span post-war. They're working like 40s and 50s and into the 60s, and he's kind of more 60s and 70s in his arguments. So you're looking at a lot of social theorizing about, what are the implications of this world that we have, this, Western sort of style of democracy and capitalism that are kind of hand in hand. She also, of course, mentions Freud, who, of course, did a lot of work on sexuality and sort of psychological, powerful psychological aspects of sexuality, in the sort of sense that in Freud that sex is a very powerful drive in human beings, and that it causes us to do things that may be beyond our sort of will and control. I mean, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Freudian theory on that sort of stuff about the id and the ego and the superego, and how sometimes the id will win out. And the idea being that, of course, that sexuality is a part of that id base. So these are some of the things that are sort of floating around in her essay, that you'll be reading along, and she'll be acting like writing in this sort of humorous, witty, kind of bantering style, and then all of a sudden she'll make these references to Marx and Marcuse, and no direct references in this chapter to Foucault, although other chapters she does explicitly in her book reference Foucault. So, but she'll make these sort of passing references that are sort of thrown in there that are very interesting, and sort of really kind of shift the tone of the essay away from what it appears to be on its surface. It actually is much more complicated than what that she's trying to sort of trick you, I think, as a reader. And so let me talk a little bit about that, some of her rhetorical strategies in this essay. Now, she makes it there's a quality in the essay of being open. She sort of sets out at the beginning, I'm going to talk about some things that we don't usually talk about, and I'm going to be really transparent about that. And if you don't, if you're not comfortable as a reader, feel free to leave. She makes this, if you're not a person who, is, this is like a really disturbing kind of aspect to this essay to me. It was kind of like, the whole idea that we're all of us are, unhappily in relationships. All of us are not. And if you're not, then feel free not to read the essay, which I was like, yeah, well, I have to read the essay because I assigned it. And so now I'm sort of in here reading, she makes it seem like you can not read her essay, but she's also provoking you. You know what I mean? There's like a contradictory, like, go ahead, don't read it, if you don't think that this is your thing. But there's also a dismissiveness to those who think they're happy. If you think you're too, you think you're happy, then you don't need to read this essay, kind of thing. That's very dismissive and offensive almost. I mean, she's really walking a line there, at least to me. I found that to be, I took that, in a negative, unhappy way. I was like, come on, lady, this is kind of unreasonable. So she's trying to be humorous. She's trying to be sarcastic and kind of to take a playful, witty tone. But at the same time, what she's talking about has a very, it's very, almost cruel at times in the way that she's talking about how love doesn't exist. And I hate to burst your bubble, but, love is, it's an illusion and it doesn't last, and you think it does, but it won't. And, you want to buy into this, and you're a kind of a sucker, right? I mean, she kind of makes it sound that way through most of it. If you believe that you're in love and you're in a happy relationship, you're just a sucker who bought into it. And this is one of my objections to the whole sort of neo-Marxist school of theory is that there is a tendency, you know, I respect that they're asking us to look at things we don't often think about, right? Things that are part of our culture that we just sort of like reflexively buy into. And of course, that's what a lot of what she's saying here is we reflexively buy into the idea of a monogamous, you know, long-term relationship. But I also find that their critique a lot of times is offensive in that they make it seem like everyone who buys into this is, you know, like an unsophisticated loser who doesn't know any better. And I've fought against that since I was a grad student and started being exposed to some of these theories. I just ultimately just reject that. I mean, I think that one of the problems in this essay is that she doesn't ever acknowledge that that except in a sarcastic way, that regardless of her points, love and the idea of a monogamous relationship is an extremely powerful idea that persists. If it's some sort of capitalist delusion to control us, then why the hell do people buy into it so intensely? Why do people feel it on such a personal level if that's all it is? I mean, if it was coming from outside the way she's suggesting it is, then why do we buy into it? And of course, she does seem to imply toward the end that, you know, it's a natural feeling in that, you know, the capitalist system kind of hooks onto it and then, you know, pulls you along because it is hooking into an emotion. But I think I don't buy that argument. I mean, I can't offer a counter argument to it at the moment, but I mean, I'm going to have to think about it long and hard to come up with something, but I'm reacting to that very skeptically. So in any case, the tone is to sort of invite us in and push us away at the same time. I find that to be interesting and sort of challenging as a reader. Diction, you'll have noticed by now that there are no or very few big words in this essay. I'm sure that the 3 things assignment is harder this week. Trying to dig out what you want to look up. I mean, there's plenty of stuff to look up, but not necessarily vocabulary words to the same extent that there were in the other essays that we've read. And then her use of theory, of course, is another piece of this where she sort of just drops this in casually. She makes the expectation as a writer that her readers will know these things. So she is, once again, not writing to necessarily, unless you're familiar with these guys already, she's not necessarily writing this essay to you. She's writing to people who are fairly sophisticated, who are conversant with these theories already, and who are willing to sort of take on, you know, let's take these theories and apply them to something different, and that they're going to be able to follow along with that and take it on. I won't say a whole lot about this, but I want you to think a little bit about how this compares to Foucault, how this compares especially to someone like Appiah, who some of you found easier to read than Pratt. Some of you found him more difficult because of his references to numerous other, you know, social theories and references to other, you know, like across the academic spectrum, as we talked about. Look at how differently he handles his sources from the way that Kipnis handles hers. He does provide explanation in brief about who these people are and what their theories were, because he's assuming that his audience, while they might be familiar, they probably aren't every day reading this stuff. She's making the assumption that her audience knows these theories backwards and forwards. In other words, she's writing to sort of her, like her cohort, I guess I would call it. People like her who are deeply entrenched in these theories and know them. Think about Pratt and how Pratt was writing to professors. I mean, on some levels, Kipnis's use of sources and whatnot is similar to Pratt's. So you might want to think a little bit through that. That's my take on it, but I mean, you all will have your own opinions about that, which is just fine. So there's some kind of interesting possibilities in the ways in which she kind of works with some of that stuff as well here. Ultimately, the essay, I think, raises a lot of really interesting things for you guys to be thinking about in terms of rhetoric, in terms of style. One of the reasons I chose it is because although it does deal in these sophisticated ideas, it does it in such a different way, and this is the week when that makes the most sense, transitioning out of the stuff we had read into the stuff we're going to read. When you read Rodriguez, his is from his memoir. There's no like explicit reference to theory in it whatsoever, although he will be really reflective about what does it mean, and maybe there's a little bit of stuff in there, but it's very minor, and way more accessible in a lot of ways. And then when we get to Said, it'll be the same thing. I mean, it's very personal. It's very much about his own sort of reaction and reflection on things that are important to him culturally. So it's sort of, this piece makes a nice transition into those other two pieces, but I find this one to be maddening, provocative. I don't agree with her, but I also do appreciate the idea that she's raising the concept that monogamy is something that we should think about, and we should wonder why is that the dominant approach to love in our culture. Obviously, it's not the only one. There's a tendency to moralize about it profoundly. It's linked up with Judeo-Christian ideas of love, and I mean, a lot of people would say, well, that's what my religion tells me, that kind of thing. I'm sure a lot of you would say that. But there are other models anthropologically. If you look at other cultures, some cultures have marriages there, where there's polygamous cultures, polyandrous cultures where there's a wife with a few husbands. It's less common than polygamous cultures where you have a man with several wives. But there are clearly other models. There are models of where people live together and they don't get married, and that's becoming more common in our culture. It is an interesting question to raise. Why is there so much cultural pressure to marry? I think we're in a transition now where there's less now than there was when I was young. I don't know. I mean, I kind of see that. But I also understand that there is something powerful about the idea of one-on-one coupling. And whether that's something that lasts, for, until death do us part or not, there is good reason to question it. The divorce rate is high. Marriages don't always last. Even when they do last, they're not always happy. It is valuable to question it, but I'm wondering about how we question it or how we think about it. It seems to me that it's so personal that it's one of those things that every individual, needs to kind of come up with a solution, or every couple needs to come up with a solution that works for them and is comfortable for them, rather than, being repressed by, the larger culture. I get I get that aspect of what she's saying, but I wonder sometimes in reading this essay whether she doesn't push it to such an extreme point that that ultimately I felt like she lost me, and I don't buy what she's saying, because again, as I said earlier, there is an aspect of love that is, it's the most deeply personal thing to fall in love with someone that'll ever happen to you, other than maybe, giving birth or conceiving a child or something. I mean, we're talking, and all of those things are related to each other. They're deeply personal, and they're very powerful, and you can theorize about them all you want and make fun of them, but people do them anyway. Even people who make fun of them do them anyway. So, why is it so powerful? If it's got all of these problems, then why is it so persistent? That's the question that we all need to be asking ourselves, and asking it both personally: why does this work for me, or why does it not work for me? Or, if you want to theorize about other people's lives, I guess you can. Why, in the larger culture, why is this the dominant thing? I mean, sure, we can see where, there's the whole marriage industry thing, about how a wedding should be and all this kind of thing. I will say that when I was growing up, I grew up in just outside of Detroit, and in a community that was almost completely Catholic and primarily either sort of Polish/German or Italian. And weddings were like, everybody's wedding was the same. I mean, there were things that had to be there. It was extremely ritualized, extremely specific. And it wasn't until I got older and went to, people who weren't from the same background as me, went to their weddings and saw that, oh, there are some other, and I'm talking, these are like Protestant weddings. I'm not talking about a Jewish wedding or, a Muslim wedding or something like that, that there were these different traditions. And so when I got married, and I will confess to being someone who has been married twice. I'm in my second marriage now. My first marriage did not work out. In both cases, I was somewhat skeptical of sort of the marriage machine. I had weddings. I was married in church both times. Actually, both times I was married outdoors, but married in a religious context, and wanted to put my own sort of personal stamp on that, because I was resisting the sort of cultural train that I grew up with, that you must have this wedding, and you must have it in this church, and you must wear this, and you must have this many bridesmaids, and you must have this food at the reception, and all that kind of jazz. So I understand the need for to sort of rebel against some of that, but again, if you do it to the point that Kipnis is sort of doing, where you're kind of basically making fun of people who do buy into it, I'm wondering if that's the most effective way to make your point. So I'll just leave it at that. I will be moving along with the other essays as we go through. I'll be interested to see what you guys have to say about this one, and have a good week.